So our discussion today is titled Educating the World's Youngest Continent. We're the whole world's little sister. It's fine. We're still the best, yes? Africa is still the best continent. Maybe the youngest, but it's still the best. And today we actually have a really amazing panel here with us. On my panel today, I have Mr. Chinezi, Chijioke. Pardon me if I'm not pronouncing the last name right. He is the founder and CEO of Nova Pioneer. A lot of people from South Africa and Kenya will have heard of Nova Pioneer. That's where its branches currently are. So Nova Pioneer is just a whole cohort of private schools, Pan-African private schools, that work to build the next leaders and innovators of Africa from a young age, all the way from kindergarten up to senior high school. Mr. Chinezi, welcome.
Thank you.
We're so happy to have you.
Excited to be here.
And next, these ones are also pretty exciting. We have two of ALA's very own alumni. We have Belinda Munemo. She is from Zimbabwe, and she is the founder and CEO of Reekworth Schools, one of the fastest growing schools in Harare. This school literally started in 2010 with only 5 students, and in 2018 now, it has an astounding 400 pupils in junior high school and in senior high school. Welcome, Belinda.
Thank you.
Welcome back. We're very happy to have you home. And the next alumni we have on our panel, we have Mr. Ngor Majak. So Majak, to us ALA students, is known as the legend whose name is known anywhere. You go to the US, you go to China, and you say Majak. Everyone goes, oh, you know Majak? He doesn't believe us, but that's actually the story we hear. And we get to have him here today. We know him as the legendary Majak, but people in South Sudan or anybody who looks him up on the internet will know him as the CEO and founder of Education Bridge, a school in South Sudan that actually works to create innovators, leaders, and peacemakers, people who are peace ambassadors. Welcome, Majak.
Thank you.
Very happy to have you. As you may all remember, on the initial program, Joseph was supposed to be here with us. Unfortunately, he had visa issues and he couldn't make it, but he sends his well wishes and is very excited about our discussion today. He gets to see it on the internet, so you guys should give really good responses. Yeah, we're on the internet for everyone to see. So, educating the world's youngest continent. Yeah, our continent has 60% of its population, myself included, under the age of 25. That's a lot, 60%. So that means we have to work towards educating 60% of the population to lead Africa into greater things and to develop it, turn it into a little Wakanda. That's a lot of people. A big Wakanda. A very big Wakanda. And that's a lot of people to educate, and we have to do it right. Because these people are the people we're depending on to build our continent. And if we don't do it right, there goes Mama Africa. So, Chinezi, please start us off. I want to know from you, ALA, at the heart of ALA's model is using innovative education systems to groom the next leaders and the next innovators, people that are gonna take us through. In your opinion, what do you think are the best innovative education systems we can use? So what systems can we use to make sure we do education right? And what skills do we instill in our youth, in our below 25 years old, to take us there? And how do we instill those skills from a young age? Because that's how they all stick. When you're a child, that's when everything sticks. How do we do that? Take us through that.
Thanks, Gorata. I think you framed it well. I think you framed our reality of being a continent in which the bulk of our Africans are young. And I think that puts a point on the imperative that the victory we are all collectively trying to solve has for the continent. I think it's bigger than that. I actually think it's got to be a top 3 priority for the world, Africa's education. Because we will soon be close to half, 40% of the world's young people, right? And that's, as we sort of to frame the opportunity and the challenge of that, it's a pretty remarkable challenge that we all collectively trying to work on. And we all got to find a way to answer that, and we all going to have different answers. And in some ways, in many ways, the answer that we at Nova Pioneer think about and the role we want to play in that is actually really resonant with the answer that ALA, and to congratulate ALA, has answered it. ALA talks about building leadership for the continent's future. Nova Pioneer was founded on a particular solution, a particular response to trying to make this the African century, right? To make this Wakanda. And our approach to that, and our solution for that, and it's going to be needs to be one of multiple solutions. Given the size of 100 million young people, is not something that is going to require that any one piece of the movement is going to solve alone. Is that we want to develop schools where young people are able to translate ideas into impact, who build a whole life of learning to be able to translate their ideas into impact. Right? And we don't want to do it just for older students. We want to start it from, I want to build a lifetime of that from age 3 through 18. And we don't want to do it for a small number of students. We want to do it for 100,000 students all across the continent who have a common disposition, a shared experience, and can do that together. Because part of the solution of this is going to be the collective capacity we build across the continents to solve together and innovate and create together. And something we often talk about, but it really resonates with what we just heard in the big group session, was that we talk about trying to develop young people who are able to shape the future, not just work in it, right? Yeah. And so everything we've built and we develop at Nova Pioneer is built around this idea of how do we cultivate a lifetime from age 3 through 18 of young people being able to marshal their passion to turn their ideas into impact. And so whether that is a great art classroom, Susan, one of my colleagues, is here, a great art classroom last year, and one of the investigations where students were building, developing, using the construction that was happening next door to them to develop their own construction of what the campus ought to be and ought to look like, and where they're constructing that at age 5, or whether it is our, Musa's another one of my colleagues, ALA graduate here, who's one of her students, I was just sitting with his mother this week, who's planning to build a plane to fly from Cape to Cairo to try and engage students across the way in 15 different countries to talk to around the theme of how do we build a future we all collectively aspire to. And our view is that if we can do that if we can do that for a large number of students across the continent throughout their lives, then that's really going to be a hugely networked and catalytic impact. And it means we've got to do 3 things. So ask so what is the sort of a bit of the technology behind that? Or a bit of the outcomes or the things we need to build in young people to be able to translate ideas into impact. They're really threefold, the way we think about them. One is that we want to cultivate the disposition, and that's through a set of character skills and experiences that we really anchor what Nova Pioneer is about. So sort of dispositions, we can talk more about what those dispositions of innovators and leaders are. So a set of skills to be able to solve problems collectively and persevere in the face of challenge. You know, when you've got that 5 million rand problem, how do you keep going, right? And the third is opportunities to do it, right? Because I don't think you switch on at age 30 or 40 and say, now I'm going to go do it. I think you start when you're young at 3 with an experience of creating and innovating and building and turning your ideas. And my 7-year-old today was building at home. You know, had an idea that she was constructing with origami. And if you build that throughout your life, then by the time you're 30 or 25, 30, 40, you are creating your building, and it's a way of living. It's a habit. It's not a specific thing you turn on later, and that's fundamentally how we think about constructing our part of our piece of the movement.
About it being a habit, so you're there to facilitate, that habit when they're at school. How do we make sure they practice that habit at home as well? Because it can't really just be a habit I practice from 8 to 5 p.m. when I'm at school, and then when I go home, I'm doing something totally different.
Sure.
This may be jumping a gun a bit, but how do you...
It's a fantastic question.
How do you make sure we also practice that habit at home?
As families, yeah. The 2 parts to this. one of which I think we've made good progress on, one of which I think we need to make substantially more progress on as an organization that we pioneer. One part of it actually is that disposition, the sort of culture principles and character skills and the language young people use. I'll use our daughter as an example. 2 days ago, she was building a tower with some blocks, and it kept falling down. And she asked, "Dad, is this always growing or solutions first?" Because always growing is when it's falling down. I'm trying again, but solutions first. I've got an idea to make it better. And her building the language that translates those culture principles into how she is living at home, as interesting as, because I'm a Noveneer parent, is really neat to see. Wow, okay, that's the conversation she's having at school about the culture principles and the mindsets and behaviors that she needs to engage the world. She's doing that at home, and then I need to be resonant with that as a parent, right? The second part of it is something where one of my colleagues, I don't know if she's here, Nana, is really helping us build out is our family engagement, right? Family engagement. And we've long talked about building, and I think schools ought to build real partnership, and particularly day schools ought to build partnership between families and schools in developing future leaders. And to do that, that has a couple aspects. It has some parent education and parent information exchange, so that you can use the same language and same practices, and there is the schism between what happens at home and what happens at school. A second is a listening and parent engagement in school, so having parents be part of the life of school and be part of, be able to be present, and students see, wow, this is a partnership. This isn't just something I do at school and go home and get to be different. And those are certainly real two pillars, and then there's sort of a common culture, and that's the culture principles that we build, so that as for students, it doesn't feel like when I'm at school, I have one set of expectations on mindset and behavior, and a different set of expectations on mindset and behavior at home.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Moving on to you, Belinda. So currently, about 21% of the African population actually attends private schools. There's a growing debate about private schools versus public schools. A lot of people are saying public schools give poor quality education. I need to make enough money to be able to afford that really expensive private school if it means it gives higher quality education. Now, you run a private school, yes. And what do you think is the role of private schools within the education sector? And where do public schools fit into the whole equation?
All right, thank you. That's a very good question. Good morning, everyone. And I feel compelled to say happy birthday, ALA. In terms of private school, I think one thing that I faced personally when I thought of the idea of starting a school was really whether to make it a for-profit or a non-profit. The thing is, within the education sector, sometimes there is this stigmatization of for-profit schools as schools that are majorly for making money and less about impact. But I truly believe that private education is one that actually helps to capacitate the education sector into creating the impact that it wants to create. So for instance, all these systems that Chinezi was talking about, those systems need resources to be able to become a reality. Yeah. Resources that public schools might not have because of perhaps the amount of fees that they charge and the amount of students that they take in. And when you have a private school, you can actually be able to create the resources, the labs, the systems that can create this ideal student that we're saying is not only just going to work in the continent, but is actually going to be an agent of change wherever they end up landing up in their career. And so I think private schools in Africa have a really, really imperative role of creating true impact because they have the resources. They have the resources to transform the child, and they have the ability financially and the financial muscle to do so. Where public schools are concerned, it's a little bit unfortunate that here on this continent, public schools are given, education is not given that much of a priority. I will talk about Zimbabwe. As you all know, Zimbabwe boasts of having the highest literacy rate on the continent. But the reality of that really is a lot of our people are just really good at reading and writing. And that's mainly because the education system just forces you to memorize information and then regurgitate that information on a test paper. If you have a really good memory, you're a smart child, and if you don't, that's it. But the problem that does is you come out from that public school system, you get into the workforce, and you're waiting for somebody else to give you instructions. You're waiting for someone else to tell you exactly what to do, so you can do it in the exact same way and do nothing more and nothing less. And that's one of the reasons why I even believe that my country is where it is today. There's so many other factors that have come into play, but the workforce that we currently have is one where there are no critical thinkers, there are no people that are actually actively leading themselves, whether they're in the civil service or whether they're in the private service. They're just waiting. And so I believe that private schools are given a unique opportunity to create systems that are going to impact and empower young people to be those critical thinkers. And they have the resources, they have the ability and the network even to actually enable those young people to get that exposure and to get that skill set to be able to make a difference. And then it's now up to those guys. It's a really huge and complex problem that we might not solve as 3 or 4 schools, but together the impact that we create through empowering those young people are actually, they give hope to the education sector that you're going to have people getting into education, creating that same impact, and maybe down to the public school level, so that you can start having that impact at a larger scale.
I absolutely agree with what you're saying. But there's something about, what do we do about private schools that are actually, I don't want to say misusing that opportunity to use their resources, to make better, more responsible, more than just students that are able to read and write. Because I know private schools that are some of the most expensive, and we have graduates coming from there that get to university and they can't cope with the work. They don't know what's going on, they're failing terribly, and they can barely graduate from university. Wouldn't that then mean they've gone through the same school from kindergarten up until senior high school? And when they get to higher levels, they can't cope, they can't do anything, they can't remember anything, they fail terribly. What do we do about those private schools? Because there's a lot of them that are in existence. There's very few private schools that do what Nova Pioneer is doing, that do what Reekworth is doing, that do what Education Bridge is doing. How do we get those private schools to kind of, lean more towards being more impactful in the community?
Well, I think that it boils down to networking and collaboration. So I would imagine that 11 years ago, when ALA did not exist, the idea was not yet a reality. If Fred or Chris or Acha or Peter went up to anyone and said, you know what, you can really create this transformative 2-year program and get young people who are energetic, powered up, and have the capacity to actually make a difference, I'm sure the generic private school would have just been like, okay, so. But right now, with the 10-year track record, a lot of people want to be associated with ALA. A lot of people, as they're seeing the results, they're seeing that it works. So the proof is really in the pudding. The proof is in the track record. So as more people see the kind of alumni that Nova Pioneer is going to get, they will garner that interest, and they will want to be associated, and they will want to adopt models. And I think right now the continent is at a place through organizations such as ALA and the African Leadership Group in general, where people are creating these collaborative spaces, even in education, starting to exchange notes and realizing that, sometimes it's not just about inventing the wheel, because somebody is doing something on the continent that is relevant and that is going to work in South Africa or in Kenya or in Nigeria. And it's a matter of us collaborating, exchanging those ideas, and really implementing. And I think more and more private schools with time, slowly but surely, will start to get the memo and will start to adapt and change. Because again, in the private education sector, there's a lot of business that goes into it. So it still boils down to competition. If more students who can afford a private school education are starting to be more interested in a certain kind of education, then the other private schools are going to need to shape up. The other private schools are going to need to get on board. And I think it's not a microwave solution, but with time, with the track record, and with the impact, those things are going to be able to be transplanted and modeled into other private schools.
Thank you, Belinda.
Sure.
The audience, if you have any questions, I hope you're writing them down. You're going to get to ask each one of our panelists a question, so keep that in mind. Moving on to you, Majak. So, according to a study, every additional year that a child is in school reduces the chances of them being involved in conflict by 20% every additional year that they're in school. This is quite fascinating. I saw this statistic and thought, really, it aligns with you. So please, Majak, tell us more about what you do in South Sudan and tell us more about Education Bridge.
Sure. Good morning, friends. So my name is Majak again. I'm from South Sudan, ALA alumni of 2011. And I think before I tell you what I do, it'll be good to give you a context of South Sudan for those who may not know. So South Sudan is the youngest country on the continent, which is good and bad for different reasons. But as South Sudanese, we are very proud about it. We became independent in 2011. Before that, we went through a long period of civil war with our brothers in the north. Then we had a short window of happiness and joy from 2011 up to 2013. And since 2013, there's been a big chaos. More than 2.5 million people have been displaced since then, and a lot of people have been killed. A lot of people live in refugee camps in Uganda and in Kenya and in Sudan. So that is the context in which I'm operating. The work that I do in South Sudan is I'm trying to educate the next generation of South Sudanese peacemakers in the context that I just talked about, and transformational leaders. We opened our first academy. It's a secondary school last year, so I took some time off from university to come and open it last year. Right now we have about 360 kids in grade 9, 10, and 11 with the hope of having a full school next year. What we are doing right now is a pilot of a model of education that use curriculums and intentional interaction, ethnic interaction to break ethnic barriers and create a group of socially minded South Sudanese who can handle or at least address some of the challenges that we have right now. So over a couple, this year, next year, we're going to be implementing our curriculum and evaluating it and see how it's working. If it shows some impacts, the goal is to create a network of secondary school across South Sudan that use that system to try to create a group of people who can be a mass ambassadors of peace and people who can change or address the challenges that we face as South Sudanese. I'm very passionate about this work. I would say for two main reasons. I do believe in the power of education to break barriers, ethnic barriers, gender barriers, and gender biases, and many of the things that we face in our communities. And my educational journey as a South Sudanese do speak to that. I left South Sudan in 2005 and I went to Kenya. I stayed there for 6 years coming to ALA, and I have changed a lot, and I'm hoping that I can help some of my students go through that journey and be able to change for the better for themselves, but also for our community and for Africa at large. I think the second reason is I do believe that young people have the capacity to initiate and do great things in their communities. We do need, in the spirit of ALA, I do believe we need a lot of leaders in my community. Myself, Daniel, or Esther Soma, or a couple of us that have been to ALA are not enough, and we need to be able to create more young people who are thinking about our community, not just themselves. So the question for me was, how do we create, how do we get some of our peers to think the same way, or to be socially conscious? And I think if I got anything out of ALA is that, you are not born a leader, but somehow, through training, going to those EL classes, inspiration from your colleagues from all over the place doing great things, encouragement, mentorship, through all those things you become a leader. And I am hoping that at our school and over the next couple of years as we build more school, we can do the same, inspire young people in South Sudan, educate them, mentor them, encourage them to be the leaders. So that is what I'm doing in South Sudan. I'm hoping it can change the trajectory in terms of people who are thinking about peace, who are thinking about South Sudan and not just the ethnic group. And yeah, time will tell. I'm excited about it. I'm also nervous about it, but I'm very happy that ALA community has been supporting me to do that work.
Thank you, Majak. Now I'd like to know if anyone in the audience has a question for any one of our panelists. Yes. Yes. Down here.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, John.
Thank you, panelists. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Chijioke Valley. I'm from Washington, D.C., and I work for an organization called Teach for All, which is a network of education nonprofits. And my question is about access with private schools. I know that access for certain communities on the continent is a huge issue. I know that private schools do elevate the quality of education. And I just want to know what you all are thinking of in terms of providing access to, or filling the gap of access for certain communities throughout the continent. Thank you.
Chinezi, would you like to go first?
Sure, and you have to do one question at a time. My view is that unless you are really lucky or really wealthy, you're not well enough served on this continent. So I think access is a very broad, it's not like bottom 20, it's bottom 80, or in not just in wealth, but obviously heavily in wealth, but in luck as well, in privilege broadly speaking, right, which is a combination of both those things. And so I think we need solutions across all sort of all that. And actually, frankly, I actually think because of that, though that's access, this need not be our top concern. I actually think our wealthiest and most privileged children would do a lot better to also have schools that create access and opportunity to learn alongside some of the less privileged students on our continent. But I think access is really broad. I think access really broadly in that term. And so I think solving at institutions and solutions, not just institutions, but solutions, there are a wide range of you all who are working on different aspects of the problem, whether it's Teach for All or teacher training, or there are lots of parts of this movement that we need to be successful, and it's a really exciting time, it can be served at multiple points. So whether it is sort of $100 sort of equivalent a year schools with huge scale, which are an important part of the solution, or whether there are Nova Pioneers, which are an important part of the solution, whether individual schools that lie somewhere along that affordability, I think are all important. The way we've thought about it at Nova Pioneer is we ask the questions: do we want to put a really broad, low-cost constraint on our schools, and then do the best that we can within that? And we thought about that for a while and said, no, that's not the question we want to solve. We want to define what's the kind of education we aspire to have our children be able to enroll in. So that's a good thing. That other option is a really good thing to do in this world. That's not the victory we're trying to win. We're trying to win the victory of what is an education that we would be really excited for our children and your children to have, and how do we make that as accessible as possible, right? And so when we confront the tension of how do we, you have 100 points, and you have to allocate 100 points to quality, affordability, and scale, right? How do you allocate those points? And we've said 50 of those points go to quality, 25 go to affordability, and 25 go to scale, and we're going to operate accordingly. Obviously we'd like 100 to go to all of them, but we don't all have 100. We don't have 300 points. And so that's how we think about. So we absolutely access is important to us, and we believe we're expanding access to a kind of education that I am, and my wife and I are very excited to have our daughter be part of. And so that's how we're solving it. That said, man, is it really important to have folks who are solving the other challenge, which is the reality of many families is $100 a year is a reach and a stretch, and I've really got to work hard at that. And how do we do that really effectively that equips those young people to be part of the future that we all want them to help create? So I think that's a really important part of it too. And I see ourselves as partners in that movement, but not solving that specific problem.
All right. I would just give an example for Reekworth. So Reekworth is a for-profit institution. It's a private school. And our model is a little bit different and innovative. As you know, there's a really large percentage of the African population that is in the middle class. And in Zimbabwe, private school education is very, very expensive and only accessed by very, very few people who can afford it. And so the model that Reekworth has taken is one that lowers that cost slightly to be able to give access to a middle class student who would not have been able to get exposure and access to a private school education. And that has helped us probably to balloon and grow so much over the last couple of years. But as a policy and the way the organization is set up, it says that at any given point, there needs to be a minimum of 15% of the student population that attend the school on a grant basis. And how that works is the 85% who can afford a private school education, who can come and attend Reekworth School as a full fee paying student, what they pay subsidizes for what that 15% pays. And it really came from what you talked about as a problem, to say a lot of families can't afford that. And I grew up in a family like that. If I wouldn't have been able to afford ALA, for instance. I just went to a Catholic school for high school. It was it was a good school, but not a great school. You know, it was just a good school, and I was highly ambitious, but I would have never been able to walk through doors of ALA and get that transformative education. And I benefited from receiving a grant to attend the school. And so I wanted to implement that in my own organization to say, look, there are a lot of young, talented students who are in really, really unfortunate circumstances. I might not be able to educate all of them, but if I have a specific number that's still going to allow me to make an impact, and I have students who are paying to enable those students to actually come to school because we don't have any external funding at all. So that helps the situation. And it might seem like a drop in the ocean, but I always believe it's just best to start. Even if you're making a drop of an impact, it's still an impact, and one day that's going to compound and actually make a difference. So that's the model that we operate on, and I think private schools have that opportunity as well to think about having a few students who can't afford it, but to give them a chance to help their families and their communities to reach transformation or even development faster than if they wait for the other students to go through the system.
I think, Belinda, also what you said about collaborations, like that collaboration between private schools and public schools, I think could also be very effective, because a lot of children can afford public schools, because for some people, like in my country, it's close to free in public schools. I think if private schools collaborate with public schools to kind of take them through that process of this is how we offer a high quality education, then kids in public schools could also get an almost equivalent education for the little or no money that they're paying. I think that could come in as well. And Majak, do you want to
so
drop
when I think
something
of accessibility, there are two things we've been dealing with. One has to do with the parental willingness to invest in the education of their children, and this is particularly concerning in our school with regard to girls' education. So if you are working on accessibility, I think it's important to figure out how you're partnering with the parents and knowing are they aware of the importance of education for their children. And one of the things we are doing right now is, we provide a scholarship and we go to primary school to identify students before they finish primary school and moving to secondary school. And we try to identify students who are doing really well but who may not be able to afford. And especially for girls, we usually invite the parent, we sit down with them, we tell them why it is important to send the daughters to school. And when we give them a scholarship, in South Sudan, we have a big issue with child marriage, sometimes forced child marriage. So we usually sign contract with parents that if we provide a scholarship, you're not going to take out your girl for the next 4 years. But I think just having that conversation with the parent, so that they understand that education is actually important, I think can help, because sometimes parents can actually have the resources, but they just don't see it as a good investment. In my case, I think the other issue is the affordability especially for private school, and it's a little bit tricky because you need the resources to provide the great quality education, but you also need to be able to have students who are from low income families. Right now we're using scholarship models, so we're trying to create leaders for South Sudan and you don't know where that's going to come from. So it's a call to all of us. If you are moved to, you can always sponsor students, and that'll be a great investment because we cannot have everything for free. Others will not be able to run. But I think those are the two areas that you should look into.
Sir?
My name is Jude Bashir. I'm a member of the European Parliament. I'm a father of 4 and a grandfather of 7. So, and if my youngest son gets married, I hope we have a few more grandchildren. So that being said, that gives you the idea that I'm deeply concerned of the education and welfare of the future generation. As you will see from my name, I'm Jude Bashir, I'm Muslim. I'm deeply concerned about conflict, which you mentioned earlier, holding back the development of that world. You see that in Libya, you see that in Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan. And you're absolutely right, education, every year that you're in education, eliminates by 20% you falling into conflict. I've just returned from Myanmar. It's not just unique to the Muslim world, but in Myanmar, the regime there, who are largely Buddhist and not Muslim, their views were very contorted and prejudiced. And I thought there's a distinct lack of education here and understanding of the world. So that being said, my question is as follows. I mean, don't forget that it was the Muslim world that invented, that gave us the first university at Al-Azhar in Egypt. It was the Muslim world that gave us Andalusia, which illuminated the Western world. So that now that the Muslim world has descended into what I can only describe into non-education, because the Western world in Europe reads 35 books a year. In Israel, they read 40 books a year. And in a Muslim world, we read less than 1 book a year. So it's a shame that we've fallen behind in education, and I wish that they catch up. My question is this, because we have people here from the private sector, and we've talked about the public sector as well. How do you inspire children to think out of the box? Because from 3 to 18, I want my grandchildren to be inspired. I don't just want them to learn and rote so that they don't enjoy themselves 18 years of their life in just trying to learn facts and figures is not for me what I'd like from them. What I want them to do is enjoy life as well as learning. I think memory is important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. The ability to think is what you should be inspiring children to do. And how do you inspire children to do that, whether it's private or public? I'd like to know that.
Our panelists are thinking they could take 2 questions and then answer them together, so we could have a second question.
Thank you very much. I think I want to commend our panelists for being in a very critical area of this continent, which is education. Well done. I have a question. Anyone can answer it amongst the panelists. I'm deeply concerned, and I think Eli is guilty of it as well, of producing young African leaders who are supposed to change the continent, but we are still producing them based on what I call the power of a single narrative. And for me, that single narrative would be BBC, CNN Incorporated. And I'll tell you why I'm saying this. I was raised in Umkhonto Wesizwe camps where every morning the day started with what we called news analysis, listening to news and news analysis. And we were forced, radio stations across the board. Now, we were taught to decipher the subtle messages where BBC would call us Umkhonto Wesizwe rebels. And they would call Jonas Savimbi's UNITA because they were supporting it, freedom fighters. In retrospect, we know what the truth is. Now, my question is, as you are in education, what do you think is the role of the media and politics, because you can't separate them, in training young Africans who are supposed to change this continent, but having a balanced view? I'm at a point where today, I listen to CNN, but I want to know what Russia Today or CGT and the Chinese are saying on the same item. And between the three, I decipher my own news and what the actual truth is. What do you think should be done in training our young Africans to do that? Because I think sadly ALA is not doing it too. It's more CNN, BBC script based.
So 2 very interesting questions. Belinda, would you like to start answering first?
All right. So I'll start with the first question about how do you inspire young minds. From working with young students from as young as, so we take students from as young as 2 years old up until they're 16. And from working with students, one thing that I realize is when a mind is still young, number one, it's very impressionable. And number two, it's very eager to learn about the world. And one thing that we have incorporated in my institution is incorporating elements of entrepreneurial thinking into the way that we teach, into the clubs that we have, into the sports that we have. And what I really mean by that is ensuring that you move away from giving a child facts and figures and try to guide them into finding out the facts and figures for themselves. And that really helps to model a way of thinking. So I believe for a child to get inspired, it's really more about what is their thought process behind it. So is their thought process, let me get an opinion, let me adopt that opinion as my own, and then live my life that way? Or is it, I'm curious about the world around, and I'm also curious to listen to what my inner voice is saying about it, and then creating and forging a path that way. And so most of the classes that you will attend or experience while you're at my school, for instance, they're classes that are not asking you or pressurizing you to remember facts and figures. We're in a changing world, and our students are made very cognizant of that through the way that we teach, that this is a changing world, and if you memorize today's facts and figures, they could actually be very irrelevant tomorrow. So you need to know what the reality is, but at the end of the day, you need to have a thinking process that inspires you to critique whatever information is before you, to really analyze and give feedback even to yourself and your actions and your decisions, and be very, very intentional about what it is that you do. And I think that can only be done through the model of how you teach, and through also just intentionally teaching those kids that it's okay to think, it's okay to ask questions. I come from a country where asking questions is somewhat controversial, and until a couple of months ago could get you killed if you asked some types of questions. But at my school, we're teaching them it's okay to say why. It's okay to say no. It's okay to seek 3 or 4 or 5 further explanations until you get it and it resonates with you, irregardless of the fact that you are young. And I think that is how you plant inspiration into young people. And that's something that can be adopted all across the board. And now to the second question about how do we change the narrative, how do we help? I think in some ways it ties into what I have said, and I think in a way I would probably respectfully disagree with the opinion that ALA is grooming people according to this Western-based narrative. One of the first classes that I attended here at ALA was an African Studies class that was talking about the role of politics and media on the continent. And it was a class that was entitled The Idea and Image of Africa. And what we were asked to do was to think about what first comes to mind when you hear the word Africa. And it was interesting because indeed what we were watching was CNN and BBC, and you have war, famine, conflict, tribalism, et cetera, and then all of a sudden, as the class went on, we all started coming to this awakening realization that we, for years, have been letting somebody else tell our own narrative. We've, for years, been allowing somebody else to tell us who we are. And we didn't even know about it. We were just living our lives. And so I think ALA, in its 2 years, really attempts to, and I think successfully does, really help you to find out your true identity outside of what the other narratives are saying, and really create that and let other people in your community know. I'll give a very practical example. When I graduated from ALA, so I come from an OK school, etc. I mentioned that before, but in Zimbabwe, it's very interesting that you speaking your mother tongue, we don't have a national dress, let's start there, and you speaking your mother tongue, my mother tongue is Shona, is regarded as somewhat primitive and backward. So the more your accent sounds like this, you're more eloquent in English, you're regarded highly. And after coming back from ALA, I decided to change even subtle things about myself, from the way that I dress to the way that I speak to people. And I get people literally shocked at me speaking to them in Shona. That's how bad the brainwashing or the being told what is the appropriate thing is. And ALA really empowers people, and I can speak for myself, and I'm sure for other people on this panel, to say, look, I am Zimbabwean, I am Shona, I am a black woman, and I am capable of doing what anyone else can do and so much more.
I would love to have all our panelists answer both questions, but unfortunately we have to, bring this to a close. It's very sad. But one last thing, something for us to leave with. We're not all entrepreneurs in the education sector. Some people don't own businesses. They just work a regular job, 9 to 5. Some people we're just the basic unit of society. So educating the future generation, educating our continent, should be everyone's job. It shouldn't just belong to education entrepreneurs. It shouldn't just belong to governments. It shouldn't just belong to ALA. It should be all our jobs. What's one final piece of advice that can inspire us to get involved, no matter who we are, no matter what we're doing? One final short piece of advice to inspire us to get involved in educating our under 25 and building our continent.
I would say, so if we are all to get involved, I think this could also be an answer to the question that was asked before. I think when it comes to education, so as when we have kids, usually as a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? And in most African countries, I want to be a doctor, and you say that's great, and you don't ask more questions. I would like to challenge us as parents, as siblings, that when we ask our sibling, what do you want to be? If they say they want to be something, let's go further and ask them why, so that they can think about it, they can actually know that there's a problem, that's why they want to become that. It's not just the role. And I think if we do that, we would create a more socially conscious young people.
They say charity begins at home. I think education should also begin at home. The right education that'll raise the right generation that'll build our continent the way we want to. Unfortunately, we have to bring the session to a close. If you have any more questions, please feel free to approach our panelists, get into a discussion. It's been amazing having you all here and engaged. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and happy birthday, LA.